Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome back to the poem of the day for today, Monday, November the 24th, 2025. This is my second attempt at this video. I did a first one, it was like 24-ish minutes or something. And then when I went to transfer it over and post it, Substack told me it didn't get the sound. So that's mildly important for this. So I'm giving it a second try, and hopefully it catches this time. But that's okay, because I was pretty rambly in the last one and disconnected, and I suspect that I will remain rambly and disconnected here as well. But part of that is, I think, the nature of Eliot's work. So if you heard yesterday's video, I read Canto 3 of The Wasteland, which is the fire sermon. And this is the longest canto thus far. It runs about 140 lines. Whereas the previous two cantos together were about 170 lines. The fourth canto, of course, is the shortest. I think the fifth one, let's see. The fifth one is, about 100. That's all, I think. So this is, that's wild. Only about 100, 110. So this is the longest canto, right in the middle. It's also, I think, the maybe toughest, most confusing, because it's hard to pick up individual speakers throughout. Sometimes I think the speakers are almost angelic, sort of like floating throughout God's eye, maybe not even exactly in the scene. Whereas previously we got some things like dialogue, even, in that pub scene that we just had at the end of Canto 2. And also this is the one where there's a lot of kind of nature description winding along the river that can be difficult to put your finger on exactly. So it's a challenging canto. I think not as challenging maybe as 4, but nonetheless, let's jump in. So the first thing we should note is that it is called the Fire Sermon, which is an allusion to a sermon given by the Buddha, wherein he warned against the material pleasures of the world, and that those were a fire that constituted a fire that was all consuming, and that could consume the person's, sort of soul, right? And that image is going to come back at the end of the canto, and that's something that's important. But I think we should let that know, make it known that at the beginning of this canto, that's what he's titling it. So the first stanza we get here, we begin with this image of the river's tent broken and the last fingers of leaf clutch and sink onto the wet bank. And that's a really tactile image of these kind of wet leaves that are just clinging, but kind of sliding down, almost like, the hand upon the window sliding down like that, right? It's so wet and clumpy and stuck together that it's getting caught, and there's this kind of overflow or this clogging that's going on there. And there's a wind across the brown land. Brown, I'm thinking with muddy, dead, desolate, like we saw in the beginning in that brown fog. And we get 2 repetitions here of the nymphs are departed, about 4 or 5 lines separate from one another, which is, I think, an interesting kind of connection back to Proof Rock, where the mermaids are singing at the end. And I know that nymphs and mermaids are not the same thing, but they occupy a similar function of being these kind of female voices or female spirits within the water that call out and sing and seduce and might have some sort of foresight. Nymphs often kind of called out the sailors, summoning them to their death. And so there's other things here that are caught along the river. It says the river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. It bears none of those things. So it doesn't carry those things, which is interesting that we get this list of objects that the river is not carrying, which suggests that this part at least is isolated, is not frequented by people. This isn't like a place where you would go and hang out at the river. This is one that's shadier and darker. And there's a line here that says, all the friends they've departed and left no addresses. So people scrammed, people separated with no intention of meeting up again. And we have a line, by the waters of Leman, I sat down and wept. And this is a kind of adaptation of a line from Psalm 137. It was by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down, we wept when we remembered Zion. And Eliot substituted Leman in there which is the French name for Lake Geneva, where he spent several weeks the year earlier in a rest cure, where he worked on the wasteland. So here's a moment where knowing a little bit about the biography of the writer helps us to understand just this kind of brief place where he's placing himself into the poem, which often we don't want to read the speaker of the poem as the author, but every now and then there's those things just kind of touch a little bit. And here is one of those places. And then we get this cold blast of air at his back, which is a reference then to his coy mistress by Andrew Marvell. And again, there's an adaptation of the lines there. So now Eliot's not just pulling influences from previous works. He's kind of retrofitting them or finessing them to make more sense within his stanzas. And then we get the rattle of bones and a chuckle spread from ear to ear, which I think is such a chilling thing, right? The cold blast, and then it shakes these bones that are there, and then there's like a laugh amid, a personification of the wind, the sound of the wind laughing. In the next stanza, we have a rat climbing through or dragging its belly along the bank through the vegetation. And then we get a line that's another reference to the Tempest, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him. So this is again a reference to Ferdinand's father supposedly dying and drowning in the Tempest, the titular Tempest within the Tempest that Prospero causes at the beginning of the poem. Of course, he's not dead, but here again we get this death by water that keeps surfacing throughout the wasteland. And then we get a description of white bodies naked and the bones there rattled by a rat's foot. So I think the white bodies is like a skeleton, and these bodies are so far decayed that it's just bones there that are rattling as the rats kind of climb beneath them. More images of like kind of a graveyard sort of death setting here. Then I don't really know what's going on here, but we get like kind of another stanza break, and there's a rhyme to these words. This Mrs. Porter business. We get porter, daughter, soda, water. There's end rhymes there. And so when I heard this read one time by Eileen Atkins and Jeremy Irons kind of sang this part almost like it was a rhyme, like a nursery rhyme or something, which I think the end rhyme suggests that, but also this is pulled from an allegorical masque, The Parliament of Bees by John Day, which I have never heard of. I never would have come up on that, with that on my own. Thank you to Michael North, the editor of the Norton edition. And then we get this final line at the end of that's in French, which is a line taken from the last line of Paul Verlaine, who's a French poet, his sonnet Parsifal. And the line translates as, "And oh, those children's voices singing in the dome." So that again could be a reason why there's this. Irons was reading it as a song, right? The next four lines, little canto there, we have two lines of repeated onomatopoeia: twit, 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 jug, 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 jug. That's birds. And as we heard from previously in the second canto, that the jug, jug is supposed to be onomatopoeia for the sound that a nightingale makes. So this takes us back to that scene in Canto 2 with the nightingale, where there's the woman that's very nervous and kind of paranoid waiting upstairs in her chamber, where she's combing her hair and it's extending, right, like embers there. And she has all of the chandelier and the candles lit and all of those perfumes that you can smell, the unguent senses there. And then remember, she thinks she hears someone creeping up the stairs there. This is relevant because of what's going to happen on the next page. She was paranoid there. Remember that somebody was going to come in and presumably assault her. And so we get, again, right after that, a repetition of that line, "so rudely forced," which was in Canto 2 when there's the discussion about Philomel, where Philomela was so rudely forced, was taken by Thérèse. And I talked previously that the Metamorphosis that was recently translated, stopped using things like "so rudely forced" there and made it more explicit that it was rape, that it was sexual violence. And so there was that undercurrent there. And then we get that again, just briefly mentioned here in that last line, teru, which takes us back to the Tereus and Philomela. But what's interesting is here he's using it in the vocative sense. So it's almost as though we're addressing Tereus here. But then we break and we go back to Unreal City. And I love these Unreal City stanzas that begin with Unreal City. It's almost like, cutting away in a movie to like, meanwhile in Montreal or meanwhile in Manhattan, right? And it just kind of, it's like that shot of the outside and it'll say at the bottom, like Manhattan or something. That's what they do with Unreal City. And Unreal City here is London, but it is also going to come to stand in for other things later. We have the brown fog in the winter noon again. So we have death, lack of clarity, inability to see, coldness. And then Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, comes in and asks in Demotic French for lunch and then a weekend at the Metropole Hotel. So the notes help us here that the Smyrna merchant, it tells us Smyrna is a city in Anatolia, now the Turkish city of Izmir. After World War I, Smyrna was the focus of a calamitous war between Greece and Turkey, which was much in the news while Eliot composed his poem. Greece's loss of Smyrna resulted in a military coup of that country, while Britain's role became a factor in the fall of the Lloyd George government in 1922. So Eliot's pulling from the headlines here and imagining this person, perhaps seeking refuge and coming to London. What's interesting, though, is just calling him a merchant here, I think, takes us back to the first canto where we have Madame Sosostris, the clairvoyant with the tarot cards. And one of the tarot cards that's pulled is the one-eyed merchant. Now, we don't have a sense that Mr. Eugenides is one-eyed necessarily, but I think the appearance of a merchant here is very interesting because we had these tarot cards laid out, and a couple of them are going to come to fruition later. And so what Eliot's doing, even though he was Christian and I believe converted to the Anglican Church later in his life, much to the displeasure of Virginia Woolf, is he's also pulling on not just literary traditions, but also several religious traditions. We had Buddhism at the beginning here. We had tarot previously. And he's sort of saying, we don't know which one's exactly correct. And so try what sticks. Try and see what works. Maybe tarot actually can tell the future more than, going to the Bible to look for signs. I think he's at least throwing that out there. He's not saying that, the Bible doesn't mean anything, but he's sort of leveling all of these influences and the possibility for them to have meaning upon the world. And this is one of the things that the modernists were so interested in, was challenging these previously existing meta-narratives that dominated the way in which people understood the world. These sorts of institutions and regimes of truth, like government, the betterment of society, institutionalized religion. They begin to look at those and go, okay, but what good has all of that gotten us? And I think we can hear that at work here. Now, there's a mention then that the Cannon Street Hotel and the Metropole, those are two real places. It's a commercial hotel in London and then a fashionable hotel in Brighton, which is a popular resort. I think there's an innuendo here that Mr. Eugenides is asking the speaker to dinner and a weekend at the Metropole at this nice resort as a sort of, attempt at a sexual liaison rendezvous hookup. And if that's the case, we also knew that Unreal City had all of those soldiers that were just kind of wandering around. So I think there's a way to read this as the suggestion of a potential for a homosexual encounter. And the reason I'm bringing that up is several times throughout the Wasteland, there are groupings or couplings that do not result in, they're not prolific. They don't result in fertility. And we see it within the land itself at the beginning, with April's the cruelest month, breeding lilacs in the dead of winter, right? We get it with a lot of just the brown fog, the leaves that are sticking, the waste, the rats, the broken bones. But then we also get it in these couplings that we had, like at the last canto with the people in the pub, and she's talking about taking those abortion meds to terminate her pregnancy, but that it's also having this effect on the rest of her body that's making her look old, right? It's decaying her and it's making her fade. We have lots of instances in here of, again, sexual violence or the occasion of sexual violence. And then this would be another time in which there would be, if I'm reading this correctly, a sexual coupling, but one that's not going to be, generative and fertile in the traditional sense. So then we have a long stanza right after this that twice comes from the perspective. We get the identification of Tiresias, right? I, Tiresias. And Tiresias is another figure who's in Ovid's Metamorphosis who is transsexual, is, I guess, the best way to put it. Changes between man and woman. And I think can be both at the same time, but strikes two snakes copulating, and then that's the occasion of switching sexes. And there's an interesting discussion in there about whether, like, is the soul gendered, right? And here we say, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, and then a little bit later described as old man with wrinkled dugs, right? So this is older Tiresias and is now, kind of both sexual expressions within their body. Now, Tiresias was blind, but had a gift of foresight, like a sort of blind prophet. And it's witnessing this event. The person is witnessing this event where a woman is at home during tea time, clears the breakfast, lights her stove, lays out food in tins, right? Drying her combinations, right? That means the undergarments. Placing the stocking slippers on the divan. And then it's a scene where an unexpected guest arrives, and it says the young man carbuncular. Now, to be carbuncular means that you have open boils, which I think, again, here we're getting an instance of somebody who's diseased and decayed, but I think you can read that as having an STD as well in this case. And he comes in, and after the meal, it says she's bored and tired, so he finds the time propitious to engage her in caresses. So he begins touching her and trying to seduce her. He's touching her sensually. But it says unreproved if undesired. So she's too tired to like really kind of push him off and push him away. But Eliot makes very clear that this is not consent, right? She doesn't want this. She's just too exhausted to like actively push him away. And then it says he assaults at once, exploring hands encounter no defense. And then we get in a parenthetical for 4 lines where it says, Tiresias, I have foresuffered all enacted on the same divan or bed. And what's odd about that is that it's basically suggesting Tiresias is saying, I went through something similar. And I don't know that there's a source within Greek literature that actually refers to that specifically, but it's an interesting moment of just kind of stepping out for a moment out of the narrative and recalling that something that happened to Tiresias long ago is being reenacted at this particular moment in contemporary London. And then it says he bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. Now, what I think is interesting about this is, so the sexual assault happens, and then he goes down this unlit stairwell. And I talked about previously the woman in Canto 2 who is alone in her room, and she's very anxious that somebody is coming up there. She's hearing this window under the door that seems to be speaking. And it describes the unlit stairwell and somebody like possibly creeping up there. And so these images are linked, I think, to suggest that not that it's the same people, but that this threat of assault and violence is all over the city. It's not just a one-time thing. So then it says that afterward, her brain allows her one half-formed thought to pass. Well, I'm glad that's over. And then she paces around the room and puts a record on. And her kind of blasé reaction to this suggests to me that this is not the first time that this has happened to her. Which again, I mean, this is the darkest, I think, heaviest portion of the poem in here. We then move to the river. And what's interesting with the river is this section begins with, this music crept by me upon the waters. And here we have again a reference to Ariel's song in The Tempest, wherein there's a large focus on the water. So I read this next portion as kind of winding down the river, because Eliot's going to give us a lot of very specific locations and very specific geographical features, monuments, buildings that you would be able to see. Queen Victoria Street, Lower Thames Street, Magnus Martyr, right, which is a church. And we're kind of like almost tracking down there, seeing the fishermen at noon. And then if you look at the way that even the lines are laid out, you'll see right here and then up here. I always thought that, just compared to the previous stanzas, it looks almost like a river winding with like different inconsistencies along the bank. And with each one of those lines, it's just a small kind of image, right? The river sweats oil and tar. The barges drift with the turning tide. Red sails, wide. Okay. Something else to point out, there's this way la 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 la, which comes from Wagner's The Ring Cycle. And it's the first part of the opera where the maidens lose the gold deposited in the river, and it's the gold that's forged into the ring that sets the action of the story. Kind of sounds like Lord of the Rings. I'm not really sure what to do with this here, but it's worth noting, I suppose. All right, so then by the end of this, the speaker, the kind of wandering consciousness, then stops. It says, "My feet are at Moorgate, East area of London, and my heart under my feet after the event he wept. He promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent?" This dialogue here that seems to be, somewhat out of context. Now, previously, we get "Trams and dusty trees, Highbury bore me, Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, supine on the floor of a narrow canoe." So we again have this very brief image, or this very brief recounting of someone who is being sexually assaulted, right? In this case, on a canoe. Undid me, I think, is the euphemism there for being taken sexually. And the person then, it says, after the event he wept, he promised a new start. I made no comment. So again, I think we're getting a sense from the woman here that this is not, this is cyclical. This is not an uncommon occurrence. This is something that happens over. And so there's no sense feeling for this person, really believing the guy that's weeping and saying, "Oh, I just want this fresh start." She's sort of like, "It's not going to happen," right? We're getting these cycles of exploitation. And then we get this interesting line here: "I can connect nothing with nothing." And I really struggle with this for multiple reasons. But if you go back to line 120 in Canto 2, when the woman is in the room kind of panicking about what she's hearing, and is it the wind under the door? She's asking all these questions. What is it? What is the wind doing? And he says, "Nothing, again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing?" So here, I can connect nothing with nothing. It's an interesting kind of double negation, because he doesn't say, I can't connect something with anything. I can't connect anything to something else. It's talking about nothing as though nothing is a thing and not just a lack of a thing. But does nothing mean the same thing in both instances? Is it, I cannot connect a thing with nothing, or I can connect nothing with no thing? I don't really know, but there's within this kind of seesaw phrase, there's this utter negation. It's like a sort of 0 equals 0. And then we get, within the last few lines, "To Carthage then I came," which is a reference that's pulled from St. Augustine's Confessions. When he arrives in Carthage, he begins to talk about all of his sensual temptations of his youth, if you will, where he does all of the bad things that he needs to be confessing in Confessions. And right after that, we get "burning, burning, burning, burning," which refers back to the fire sermon. "O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest," burning. So that repetition of "the Lord, thou pluckest," Eliot will do this several times. He does it in the Hollow Men as well, of kind of saying a religious phrase, repeating it, but then leaving part of it out. And again, I think it's just that way that subconsciousness works, where if you have something stuck in your head, you sometimes hear it, or you just pull it out again real quick. And sometimes you also just kind of pull bits and snatches of it. And then it's bookended with this burning. So there's this dialogue at the end of the poem between the fire sermon and the burning that's there, but then Augustine's going to Carthage, where he's going to talk about the burning of his sexual desire, but also the need then to confess, to be purged, to have some sort of catharsis at the end there. So I mentioned, the tarot earlier and the possibility of the tarot working. At the end of this, Eliot is putting into conversation two ancient texts, one from like Eastern religious Buddhist tradition and then one from Western Christian tradition, and putting them in conversation with one another right at the end, which I think is an interesting kind of modernist pluralistic gesture there, as though grasping for any sort of thing, any sort of spiritual solution that could re-enchant this world that has been this wasteland that has been torn apart by destruction, bomb, death, sexual assault, lack of growth and fertility, all of those things. That's all I want to say today for Canto 3. Take 2 was better, I can assure you. Hopefully this one sticks. And thank you for joining us again. Tomorrow, Canto 4, I'll read it. And until then, peace be with you all.